Hi guys, this week we'll be covering scaling issues in landscape ecology, chapter 2 in your book. I am hoping that most of you have had the chance to order the book. Do send me an email or let me know if those books have not come in yet, and maybe we can figure out a way to post some of the content from this chapter. Unlike chapter 1, that chapter is not available through the publisher as a downloadable PDF. So just check in with me if you're having trouble getting the book. With that, let's launch into So, in order to predict the consequences of human impact, we really have to be able to extrapolate information across scales, and that includes scales of space and time. We need to be able to understand how patterns change with spatial and temporal scales, and it's important to remember that large scale as a term in cartography means zoomed in, a high degree of reduction, such as a street map in New York. Maps that are zoomed out, a map of North America in cartography, are considered small scale. And we refer to framing of scales in the opposite way in ecology. In landscape ecology, for that reason, it's often helpful to use terms like fine scale and broad scale rather than small scale and large scale, since we work with cartographers, and a lot of landscape ecology now includes mapping. So wanted to kind of make that point early on. The book discusses some scale terms and definitions that it would be good to familiarize yourself with. I'm not going to read these to you. This is also a call out in your text, just talking through terms that we'll revisit throughout the semester and throughout this chapter, like grain, extent, scale, level, hierarchical structure, scaling up, scaling down. So take some time with those definitions. So spatial scale really encompasses the entire area over which observation and management occurs. The smallest unit of observation or management action is our grain, and the spatial scale is changed when either the extent or the grain are altered. So various spatial scales are shown on this figure and illustrate differences in measurements arising from different scales. Similarly, temporal scales. Temporal scales encompass the entire time span of interest, with the smallest unit of time over which observations are aggregated, again, the grain. Temporal scale is changed when either the extent or the grain or the both are altered. So in this figure, while we hold spatial scale constant, temporal scale is changing, and it shows how different patterns might emerge at different temporal scales. This this really nice diagram is pulled from your book, and it kind of reviews various ecological elements that influence boreal forest habitat. First, there are two nested hierarchies captured in this diagram that are worth looking at a little more closely. We have forest systems captured here in the scaling, the hierarchical relationship within a forest system from the needle to the crown, to the patch, to the stand, to the forest, to the landscape. And you can see how those various elements of a forest system operate in different scales in space and time. And then we've got an interesting weather hierarchy captured here, from a breeze to a thunderstorm to a front to long waves to El Nino to climate change, and a depiction of, again, how these various weather processes function in space and time. So the diagram does a good job of capturing just a host of different space-time relationships within an ecosystem. We can look at how organisms might move around the ecosystem, from their daily food choices to a home range to movement through dispersal and migration. We can look at disturbances on this figure in the system, from physical disturbances like fire and climate change to biotic disturbances like a spruce budworm outbreak in herbivory. And even when we think about a herbivory, we have organisms that are going to operate as herbivores at different scales. So we might have a mouse, a beaver, a moose, all functioning in this ecosystem as herbivores, with that disturbance occurring at very different spatial and temporal scales. So I enjoyed looking at this diagram. I hope you guys will as well. So let's talk a little bit about how we consider grain and extent in our own field studies, ecological studies. We know that changing the scale of an observation, so changing the extent or the grain, leads to changes in the variability of our observations. So let's consider what we mean by this. When grain is held constant, as we see in the A figure here, the relationship between spatial grain and extent, when grain is held constant and the extent is increased in a patchy environment, the variation between observations is going to increase. It's increasing because the extent incorporates more of that variability within the landscape, within the area of time or interest. Alternately, when extent is held constant, increasing the grain size is going to result in less variability among our observations. And that's because fine differences get smoothed out or averaged out when larger grain size is used to make our observations. So it's important for us to really think about the scale of sampling and what our goals are when we're conducting ecological field experiments. Some of those considerations might be how big of an area or a window of observation is needed to represent the process that we're studying. What grain size is needed to make appropriate observations. Considerations might be including the size of what's being measured. We've got, are we measuring grasses? Are we measuring trees? How often the process of interest actually occurs? And at what rate does it occur? Are we studying hurricane blowdowns or single tree fall gaps within a landscape? They happen on very different scales. What is an appropriate extent and grain combination is important. Some studies can require large extents with coarse grains, but others can require large extents with fine grains. And then what other scales are important? We know that we might be studying an organism at one scale that is influenced by a process that occurs at a finer or broader scale. So the relationship between variability and grain size is captured here. This is actually from the classic paper that Wiens wrote in 1989 that is included as a reading this week for you guys. So it's good to kind of spend some time thinking about this relationship between variability, spatial variability, and grain size. And this depicts kind of what we just discussed in the prior slide. As grain size increases, the amount of variation between observations decreases. At the same time, variation within individual grains increases with increasing grain size. If you look at the bottom panel there. So again, we have to think about how this relationship between grain size and spatial variability in our system affects our ability to detect patterns and to draw meaningful conclusions and make comparisons within studies, and have that influence our decisions on how large the study area should be, how many replicates are we going to select within our study area, how many sampling plots, how often do we sample. All of these questions are going to impact our results. There are also obviously very practical implications to extent and grain when designing studies that involve personnel, the time associated with collecting data at a finer scale, and that cost. So one of the classic examples, again, that Wiens referred to in his paper is that it's good to understand that relationships amongst elements or organisms within a system often change with scale. So, for example, in a hardwood forest in the northeastern United States, least flycatchers are negatively influence the distribution of the American redstart. This is because of interspecific competition and territoriality that plays out at a finer scale on the ground. But regionally, we know that these two organisms are positively associated with each other. So apparently that broader scale influence of habitat selection, the fact that both of these species are associated with the same habitat type, overrides the much more narrow scaled relationship of interspecific interaction between the two. And we see similar scale dependent habitat relationships in other organisms and shrub steppe birds, and interspecific associations among plant species, within phytoplankton and zooplankton, and patterns even of moss colonization on moose dung. So the book spends a good bit of time discussing hierarchy, theory, scaling, nested patch dynamics, and so let's visit some of those themes because I think they'll be important throughout the semester. So this is an example of when patch structure is hierarchically nested. Patches occur within larger patches and so on. And different processes are likely to operate within each domain of scale here. So this produces what we would refer to as a variance staircase that can be used to characterize the scales of nested patch structure within a landscape. So here we have the distribution of a rare plant And we're able to take that from the plant itself to aggregate of plants on up to clusters of glades all the way up really to the geographic range within Missouri. A classic example of hierarchy systems theory is the biological hierarchy. It's probably the most familiar example of a hierarchically organized system. And it's one that you all are familiar with if you've taken organismal biology in the past. That takes you usually starting with this lowest level of hierarchy all the way up to the organism and then on up beyond to populations and systems. But as you all probably know, in this system of hierarchy, cells are nested in tissues, tissues are nested in organs, organs and organ systems and organisms. We take that to populations, communities, landscapes, and the biosphere. Within organisms, systems may operate through negative feedback mechanisms that help them maintain homeostasis. Different processes are likely to maintain populations. Negative feedback, such as predator-prey dynamics, are going to work to maintain a system of homeostasis at the level of the population. Conversely, in some cases, positive feedbacks, for example, overgrazing, can lead to more overgrazing within at the community or ecosystem level and can actually lead to a shift in the system state to a state of desertification with overgrazing. There's a similar positive feedback mechanism that can happen with invasional meltdown at the community ecosystem level. So when we have an invasive species that's able to take hold within a system, and then that can make it easier for the next invasive species to invade to the point where we start to lose keystone elements within a system, and again, a shift in system state. The book, in talking about hierarchical organization touches on population dynamics. And for those of you who haven't taken community ecology, I thought it would be good just to touch on what seems to be some presumed knowledge about population dynamics in the textbook. So we know that a species that is linked to a certain habitat may assume, particularly to patchy habitats, may assume that same patchy distribution of the habitat itself. So with several different populations within habitat patches that are distributed at different distances from each other, we have what we might refer to as patch dynamics and also metapopulation dynamics within that network of somewhat independent populations functioning in a much larger landscape. So we see this sort of patchy dynamic for species that live in wetlands and alpine areas, on mountaintops, on islands, places where particular soil types or forest types or other niche requirements lead to the limited extent of the habitat that the individual organisms depend on. So when this is the case, a lot of times individual organisms are going to periodically disperse from one population to another. This is essential for genetic exchange between the populations. A group of interlinked populations with each different population located in its own discrete habitat patch is called a metapopulation. So there might be quite different levels of dispersal that happen between populations of a metapopulation. So for example, a really large overcrowded patch is unlikely to be able to support much immigration from neighboring populations, but it can act as a source for dispersing individuals that are moving away to join other populations or even to create new ones in some cases. In contrast, a small population, maybe in slightly inferior habitat, is unlikely to have a high degree of immigration. Instead, it can actually receive a high degree of immigration. A population that requires net immigration in order to sustain itself operates as a sink, and those populations that produce many individuals that often immigrate out of the population is considered a source population. I think that's enough to give you guys a base. So one of the classic examples of hierarchical structure are streams and rivers. We know that we can look at habitats nested within these systems all the way from microhabitats to small pools and rifts that then make up a stream reach. Reaches may be nested into stream segments, and et cetera. And we also know that different processes operate at each scale with which we might view these riverine systems, and that these processes influence the structure and the dynamics of a stream system over time. So a stream system might be influenced by processes like climate change and tectonic uplift at its broadest scale, while a reach might be influenced by smaller temporal and spatial scale processes like channel shifts or cutoffs. And we get all the way down to the level of microhabitats that can be influenced by disturbances and processes such as sedimentation and also organic matter transport within that small microhabitat. So each of these processes operate at different temporal and spatial scales. In the pink line column, the pink row at the top of this figure sort of gives an estimate of the spatial and temporal scale. And then it also, we have sort of scaled ecological consequences that we might consider for each of these nested extents of stream habitat. I enjoyed looking at this diagram, and I actually have included here a link to a mapping tool. Since you guys are now experts on the Black River, I thought you might enjoy looking at this mapping tool and some of the spatial data that's been populated in it, and exploring a stream you're familiar with at these various scales. So the book gets pretty heady with hierarchy theory, and I wanted to just break down a few of those concepts for you guys and hopefully leave you enlightened and not further confused. So to what extent are landscapes a level in sort of that traditional biological system hierarchy is somewhat of an open question. And in the figure that we looked at, it does include landscapes as a level between community and ecosystems and between the biosphere. But I think it's somewhat open to debate and depends on how we define a landscape. So nested patch structure in ecological systems abound, just like the example we saw with streams and rivers. Although landscapes exhibit nested patch structure, that doesn't mean that it necessarily is hierarchically organized. So levels in a hierarchically organized system, recall, come from interactions at the levels below. Higher levels are not simply a collection of their parts. Not all hierarchical systems are nested. For example, food chains are hierarchical, but not nested. We know that predators are not made up of prey. Rather, it's a relationship that we're capturing in those in the hierarchical system of food chain. So there is an important distinction as to whether a system is hierarchically organized or structured. And similarly, scale and level are distinct terms. When we talk about scale in landscape ecology, scale pertains to a physical or a temporal dimension, such as grain or extent, and scale has units of measurement. Levels refer to a level of organization in a hierarchy. It can be an entity, it can be a system of interacting components, and although the level may be characterized by temporal and spatial scale, it has no units of measurement. So a level might be an organ system, but there's not a unit of measurement that relates to an organ system. And the book gets into extrapolating across scales. The conversation that I posted with the folks that work on the Southeastern Blueprint also helps us think a little bit about what we wrestle with when we think about extrapolating across scales. The book gets into quite a bit of modeling theory. That's not something that you'll be tested on. I am trying to keep this course a little bit higher level than some of the deeper dives that the book does. So I hope that might relieve you a little bit. Most ecological research is conducted at relatively fine scales, but especially with the use of GIS and our ability to try to think about issues at broader and broader scales, we're increasingly asked to scale up the results to understand the broader implications on some of our research on environmental challenges. And conversely, downscaling is when we take information obtained at broader scales and try to make inferences about local scale patterns or processes. And again, we see these sort of temptation to upscale or downscale our data with just the data revolution that we've seen over the past 30 years. So sometimes upscaling and downscaling data can be justified when we know that the spatial variance scales in a predictable way, that it scales in a linear way, and sometimes it's not justified. So I've got an example I pulled from, many years ago when I was working with the Nature Conservancy. Some of the first sea level rise bathtub models had come out, and there was folks working to provide these models to national wildlife refuges really across the country. And they were using upscaled data, regional data, NWI data to classify habitats, national elevation data sets to understand elevation and inundation within landscapes, and then very general regional tidal erosion and accretion data. So these were regional scale data inputs that you'll see in the next slide really altered the outcomes of the study. And so in this particular instance, a group of partners got together that felt that they had the information more downscaled, finer resolution, finer grain data to come in and be used to inform the model of how habitats were going to shift and change within this particular area. And so they were able to increase the resolution of the data using localized data. They used site-specific reclassification of the National Wetlands Inventory data. They had access for this geography to high-resolution LiDAR, which was superior to that national elevation data set, and then actual local data on tidal range, erosion, and accretion rates. So to orient you guys a little bit, we are not far at all from the Black River in looking at this map, but this is an extent of the Winyah Bay landscape outside of Georgetown, South Carolina. This is the convergence of two river systems, the Waccamaw River and the Petey River, that come together just below the extent of this map to form Winyah Bay. And what we're looking at here is a prediction, a forecasting prediction about to what extent we will see a shift in habitats from freshwater forested wetlands to brackish marsh within a really narrow time frame. Again, this study is one that was conducted about 10 years ago, so this 2025 prediction was a little further out than it is now. And what you'll see is that the map on the left is that regional prediction using those very upscaled regional data sets that were available, and they predicted an enormous shift in habitats in a relatively short time frame in this landscape, and one that everyone knew was probably inaccurate. The map on the right shows the extent of habitat change in that teal color within the same time frame using the more localized data. And so just an example of what happens when we use upscaled data for relatively small extent geographic area. The book also goes into the concept of downscaling and specifically downscaling species distribution models. So because occupancy patterns of species scales often in a predictable way with grain size, we can use those simple power law distributions or linear relationships to understand how occupancy scales. This is similar to the example that the Southeastern Blueprint folks give about the distribution of maritime forests. So it's possible to use these relationships in developing methods of extrapolation that permit the downscaling of coarse data to predict the occurrence of species at a finer scale or resolution. But we know no ecological or biological system remain constant over an infinite range or scale. So it's important to understand different domains of scales and what relationships exist amongst and within these domains of scales and when there's a shift. So the concept of cross-scale interactions and transfer processes are two that I think are worth pausing on as well. Cross-scale interactions are processes at one spatial or temporal scale that interact with processes at another scale, such as when sort of fine-scale land management practices can interrupt much broader scale nutrient cycling. Interactions between local scale processes can have really wide system effects that result in nonlinear dynamics and system states. In the cross-scale interaction framework, there's often a transfer process. Examples of these are water, wind, or animal dispersal, and these processes can operate at intermediate scales and are really responsible for facilitating interactions between fine scales and broad scales. And a really nice figure from the book that captures this concept that scale and predictability are related. An increase in the spatial extent of an investigation generally requires an increase in the temporal extent or its duration, and that studies that are conducted at the appropriate spatiotemporal scale will have higher predictive power. So I think this is a nice graph that captures that concept. And the book also touches on a really interesting tool that we've seen ecologists use over time. So given the difficulty of conducting broad-scale studies over long enough periods, ecologists have used a workaround where they select study sites that represent really the range of conditions that we might expect in our system. And that might allow us to stitch together a hypothetical time series based on a range of landscape configurations present in a region. And so this is referred to as space for time substitution. And it, of course, assumes that space and time are interchangeable, which really may or may not be a reasonable assumption. And you have to think a lot about how you're controlling for some other variables if you choose to try to do a space for time substitution study. And I'd be curious to know if any of you guys have been involved in a study like this. Just a handful of questions to reflect on at the end of the chapter, and we'll wrap up scaling and landscape ecology. Thanks, guys.